Reds. This is kind of the first wave spreading across the Arabian Peninsula and spreading across kind of part of North Africa, Egypt and Libya, and up into Syria, going all the way over here into this zone. And then finally the last wave is coming up over in this direction from this time period. So this is kind of the Middle Ages that we're looking at. All right, so here we're looking at this image of Jerusalem. And this is the Dome of the Rock. Now, this building is made with a beautiful golden dome. It's got an octagonal form, and I want you to notice that the dome is actually really tall. We can see that the drum that holds up the dome is the same size as the base of the dome right here, so it makes it look elongated. Now, we look at this beautiful blue color. This is blue tile work, and that is a later addition. So that's from like the 1600s. So as beautiful as it is, it's not what we're going to be paying attention to right now. So this is in the city of Jerusalem, which, as I'm sure you know, is very contested. This is a city that is originally would have been controlled by ancient Israel. Then you know that the Israelites were forced out of the Holy Land, most of them. Then it becomes a Muslim area and a Christian area. There's a lot of competition over it. And so this building is not a mosque, it is not a prayer hall, but it is like a temple zone. And it is there to commemorate a political as well as a religious phenomenon. And that is kind of staking a claim to this zone and city that was very sacred to all three Abrahamic religions. So this is on this site in Jerusalem that used to hold the temples to Solomon in ancient Israel. And it now contains a mosque, which we can't see very well. It is kind of over here. And this has got the prayer wall, and this is where many Israelis go to pray on a daily basis. Now we're looking at the inside of it. And the Dome of the Rock basically is a shrine to this rock right here. This rock is considered sacred. And this rock is important because when Muhammad spent his last night on earth, he gets transported from Mecca. He gets transported from Saudi Arabia all the way to Jerusalem in a miracle. And he basically ends up here. And then he meets with a spirit who kind of escorts him to heaven. So this is this intense kind of emotional kind of closure to the life of Muhammad that is reflected here. Now this rock is sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths. It is associated with the rock where Adam was buried. So the first human according to the Abrahamic faiths. It's also associated with where Christ was crucified. And of course, it's associated with Muhammad's death. So we've got death on all three kind of religions happening here in relation to it. It has marks in the stone, and some of those stones look sort of like hoof prints. So the jinn who took Muhammad up to heaven had like a horse-like body, so kind of leaving hoof-like prints in the stone. Now, when we look at it all together, we can see this kind of elaborate mosaic work that's decorative. It's very similar to the kinds of work we saw in the Byzantine Empire in churches. And remember the gold that we saw in Byzantine empires and how the gold was kind of reflective of heaven? We're seeing that here as well. We've got this kind of lovely treatment of the stonework. This is, again, something that's coming out of the Byzantine Empire. But what we're going to see is kind of a transformation in Islam of Byzantine and therefore kind of Roman art and iconography, and seeing it transform to become something very different. And we saw that happening when we were looking at the way that Christ was portrayed back in like the late antiquity and the Byzantine Empire. So remember we saw Christ being shown as Apollo or Christ being shown as the emperor. And so we're taking and reusing things and reinterpreting them. So what we have here are these kind of design and floral techniques up here. And this is because for many variants of Islam, representations of holy subject matter should not be considered representational. This is not true of all Muslim religious practice, but many of them say this goes against the idea of the graven image that we are told not to create. It also connects with the idea of creativity. Now, all the Abrahamic kind of constructions of God see creativity as fundamental to the nature of the divine. But Islam moves it in a slightly different direction. For ancient Israelites, the Hebrews, for the Christians, it's nestled in the Word of God. God speaks and God causes things to happen. And that the physical, written or printed Word of God is divine and reflects that creativity of God. It's very similar to the Islamic version of speech, but it's a little different. There it is that there is this profound creativity in God's words, but they don't necessarily have to be written out to have that. But those people who do write them out, whether they're on tiles or they're written as calligraphy, they are accessing divine creativity. And people who play around with images and make images are creating, connecting again to divine creativity. And so that means that when we're looking at buildings or artworks that are associated with Islam, they are literally filled with the power of God. So that's going to be a very important idea. So we've got these kind of Roman elements, and you guys probably noticed this when we're looking at the church, this building. Here we go. It's a centrally planned building. It's an octagon, and it's got a dome. And that means that we can see that there is an aisle that goes all the way around the side of it. Now, this kind of aisle is called, all the chalk is in there. All the chalk is gone. Life cannot continue. This is called an ambulatory. Write this word down. ambulatory. And it means you can walk around it. So we could call the hall outside this door an ambulatory because you can walk around this whole floor all the way without being interrupted. And it's towards the outside. So this ambulatory means that it's a process, it's an experiential process that you go through when you're in the building to look at it from different points of view. And of course, when we look up here, we can see that we have passages from the Quran, the holy text of Islam, and they are up there in gold on black on the dome itself. And so they're bringing that creativity and that power and energy into play inside this dome. Okay, this is also associated with being the rock where Abraham, he of the Abrahamic religions, was asked by God to prove his faith in God. So Abraham is told to prove to God that he's faithful, and God says, I want you to sacrifice your son, Isaac, to me. This is a very famous Renaissance sculpture from Florence by the artist Ghiberti, and if you haven't taken Art History 270, you will certainly learn about it in Art History 270. So here is Abraham. Here is his son, Isaac, and he is following God's will. He is getting ready to cut his son's throat to show God he believes in what God plans. And God, as he's getting ready to cut his son, God sends down an angel to stop him. So here comes the angel flying in, and then here is a ram ready to replace his son on the sacrificial altar. stuff. And then here we kind of see the representation of Muhammad flying into the heavens. This is from the ascent into the heavens. This is something called a Persian miniature, and you can see these winged beings flying down to greet him. Okay. So we are now looking at Herod's temple. This is a reconstruction of Herod's temple, and it's right next to Solomon's temple. And these are basically about where the Dome of the Rock is located. So Herod was basically a governor of ancient Israel compared to Solomon's temple, and where Solomon was king. And this is, both of these basically are supposed to reflect imperial power. This is supposed to be Solomon as leader of all of ancient Israel. Herod the Great was basically a Roman governor. So he gets a bigger, more elaborate, because you know the Romans are going to have to build a really fancy site for their people. And all of this gets destroyed over time. Another reconstruction of what the Temple of Solomon might have looked like with brick wall. And now we go back to the Dome of the Rock. Okay, one of the things I want you to notice is we have arches for the windows, and we have these relatively flat surfaces. We have columns, and the columns we know are coming out of ancient Greece and Rome, but they've been reinterpreted many times. At this point, people aren't thinking of them as, oh, that's ancient Greece and Rome. That's just, we use columns, elaborate columns, and they have elaborate bases, and they have elaborate capitals. And cutaway view so you can see it. And I was talking to you guys about divine creativity, so I'm going to show you the exterior of this shrine for the Dome of the Rock. But what's going to be useful for it is to understand how that creativity can be manifested. How many of you have pieces of paper with you that you can get out? Okay, so pull out a piece of paper, get out a pen or a pencil. We're going to do this exercise. Okay, so there's this idea that goes all the way back to Plato about the divine nature of things and how this is kind of invested in geometric quality. Well, this is something that is very key to Muslim design and architecture. So we're going to start right here, and we're going to make 4 squares. So make one big square. It doesn't have to be perfect. So we got our square. Do you guys have a computer program that lets you draw on it? And go ahead and try that. Okay, and so now we're thinking about how the divine can be expressed in many different ways. So let's just really quickly take the idea of let's divide our squares diagonally. So I'm going to do it like this. And now you can see that I made a design that has a diamond in it. But I can turn this one, I can rotate it, and now I can make it parallel, and I have a different kind of design that I'm putting in it. So we're looking at multiplicities of design that are going to be really important in tile work or pattern work in Islamic art. So then I might make this one go like this. So now I have like an arrow shape, so I can repeat this over and over again and have like chevrons going across the board. Or I can go like this, and I can have diagonal stripes going across. Or I can say, what if I put right in the center of each line, another diamond, and so you see you have, just through these relatively simple shapes, kind of a multiplication of potential imagery that's happening. What if I change some of the colors? So again, I'm multiplying out the possibilities. So we can see here, we've got a tile right here that has yellow and yellow, but depending on how the tile gets turned, it's going to have a different effect in the shape that it's creating. And then what if we put in over here a spiral, and we have a reverse spiral over here. And over here, etc. So we can get really elaborate designs fairly quickly that reflect this kind of divinity of Allah and creativity of Allah. So what I want you to do with your 4 squares is now I want you to create your own repeating pattern, put into a pattern that makes another pattern. Go. All right, what have you got? Pick them up and show them. Nice. 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 Good. Very nice. Good. You got one for me?
No.
Nice. Nice. You have one for me? You guys, we live in the 21st century. Sure, progress comes up.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Nice. Very nice, like that. Good. Good. Nice. 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 Very nice. Well done. Good job. Good job. Do you have one for me? Very nice. Oh, nicely done. All right, good job. So it's interesting because when we've been looking at different polytheistic cultures, or we've been looking at Christianity, we haven't like seen this connection with creativity that specifically kind of ends up having a big influence on art production. So I think that is a really interesting quality to think about. Okay, so now we've gotten to calligraphy. And the thing about calligraphy is, you know, this is being written essentially in the Middle Ages. And so this is an era when large amounts of the population cannot read. They are illiterate. And because of that, reading is a very specialized skill. In Islam,
reading is very closely related to learning the Quran and then becoming a religious reader. And so what this means is that we're going to be looking at the production of writing and reading joined together with that concept of this fundamental creativity that is associated with the faith, with the nature of Allah himself. And so the writers who are literally writing the text are coming up with their own versions, their own calligraphic representations of Arabic lettering that are filled with this quality of the divine. This can only have happened in an era when writing was relatively rare. And also, you're writing texts that don't have to be systematized in the same way that we do now. So when you guys are reading in your textbooks, for example, or you're reading any book at all, it is highly systematized about how it represents words and letters, even if it's in a fancy font. But here, each writer, who is often a master of a school of learning about the Quran and interpreting and understanding the Quran and then writing it out, was imbuing it with that divine creativity. And that meant that it was often not easy for everyone who could read to read that particular passage. It kind of belonged to a group. But I want you to notice that there are essentially what we call diacritical marks. They're in red. And then we can also see up at the top, there is writing in gold. So it's very kind of filled with these kind of religious possibilities within the text itself. So we're going to look at architecture because especially for the era that we're studying in class, ancient to medieval, we're going to see a lot of architecture surviving. More and more stuff survives during the Middle Ages than from the ancient world, but basically architecture means that's something that we can study quite well because so much of it survives. So one of the things that happens with Muhammad is when Muhammad, his family, his immediate family dies, and he is sent to live with his aunt in the town of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And in Mecca, he is not a high-ranking member of his family. He doesn't seem to be terribly interested in trade. So remember, Arabia was kind of a hot part of the nexus of trade coming from India, coming from Africa, coming from China, coming from Europe, and all mixing through this area. So there's a lot of kind of just literally trade networks and moving materials happening in this region that's going to be really important. And because it's so dry, it takes a level of skill to be able to get through this region successfully. So he is not terribly interested in his family's work, but he is well aware that everybody in Mecca is, probably like him, a polytheist. So they believe in many gods. And they have this little building, a little square building, and this is where all the important families in town, so extended families, store the sacred representations of the particular god that is their patron deity. And that's known as the Kaaba today, the sacred heart of Islamic religious practice. And he basically goes to the Kaaba and he ransacks it. He destroys a lot of the images, he hides some of them, and he does this because he's had a vision. And the vision basically tells him, there is one God, this is Allah, and you are going to be the final prophet of God. So you will speak God's kind of final conclusions about what the faith is. So when he does this, he causes a lot of trouble for his aunt and his extended family because people know who it was who did this. And also he's trying to proselytize his vision, his faith, to all the people of Mecca. But since he's just torn apart
this kind of sacred heart of the city, a lot of people are very resistant to him. They're so resistant that they really want to kind of put an end to him and his religious practice. He flees to a city called Medina, which is kind of far away. And he gets to the city of Medina and he starts preaching there. And while he's preaching there, he gets a house to live in. And the houses, so this is important, I want you to know this so you can write about it on an exam. See, I gave you a hint. So I want you to write about this. I'm going to turn the light up. We are looking here at a mosque. This is a mosque in Tunisia. And it's very, very much like the design of Muhammad's home in the city of Medina, which would have looked like this. It had an entrance gate with a wall, and then it's kind of rectangular. And back here were the entrance to the house and the rooms of the house. He's going to stand right here in the doorway, and he's going to preach right there. Then, here's the wall. They have palm tree trunks, which are going to stand as columns over here, and there's going to be a roof over this to shade people who gather in the courtyard. Because, it's in Arabia. It can get really hot and really difficult. So you want some shade for people over there. And so if we look at this, this is going to turn into the prayer hall, right here. This part right here is the courtyard. The tree trunks with the awnings or shade over them become these arcades going around the side to protect the old and the weary and the sick. And we have these entrances right here. So what's interesting is he gains a lot of followers when he's in Medina, and they go back to Mecca and they take political control of Mecca and they turn it into a monotheistic city-state. Get rid of all the polytheism, and they build the first mosque. And of course, it's based on the architecture of his house. So I really want you guys to know that one. Okay, so as Islam spreads, it spreads very, very quickly. And it's kind of an example of dramatic cultural, religious, political change. It sweeps across North Africa, and in this case, it's going to get all the way to Spain and Portugal. And so we're looking at the city of Cordoba, and we're looking at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And I want you to notice there's a church in the middle of it. And look over here, this is a minaret that got turned into a bell tower. Because during the Renaissance, so around 1400 to 1600, these buildings get turned into church architecture on the top of the Muslim architecture. So here we've got the arcades along the sides to shade people. Here's the courtyard, and here is the prayer halls right here. And you can see there's a huge amount of space for the people to pray right here. Also, they were really interested in bringing kind of fruits and plants that you could eat or that you could get a commodified material from across these Islamic states. And so there's a fascination basically with transporting plants from India to Africa to Europe to wherever they have political authority. And so things like oranges are going to become very, very popular. All right, now we're going inside the Great Mosque of Cordoba. We already saw this on our Quizlet set, but here we have double-stacked arches. This is a new innovation. The Romans didn't think to do something like double-stacked arches, but these Muslim architects did. And what this does is it allows you to have a really high roof to get the circulation of air in the room and to let in more light. So remember, hypostyle means we have essentially a forest of columns in rows that let them support the roof and give you protection from the weather. And we're using that red, white pattern. That's the stone, kind of the decorative stonework being used in the Roman and in the Byzantine Empire, and this is their take on it. So this is the main hall. This is where ordinary Muslim people would come to pray. And now let's look, wrong direction, over here. This is where the caliph would come. This is the leader, the political and religious leader in Cordoba. And this is where he enters into the building. And if we look through this arch, I want you guys to notice this is a horseshoe arch. It bulges in a little bit right here. And check this out. This is the Qibla wall. This is the mihrab right here that shows the direction to pray. But look at his horseshoe arches. They've gone like totally crazy. They're so elaborate. He doesn't just have red and white. He has alternating with black and gold. Very, very elaborate. When we look up, he doesn't just have double stacked horseshoe arches, he has a big single horseshoe arch. And in front of that, we have tri-lobe arches that have another arch above them. So much more fanciful and elaborate. By fanciful, I mean talking about that kind of creativity of the divinity. That he is kind of in charge of managing that and helping his people with that. So he is elaborated, his space is elaborated more than the general space is. Okay, now just in front of that mihrab we were just looking at, so right here is the mihrab. And now we've walked up to it and we look, wrong direction. We look straight up, we're gonna see there is a mihrab dome. And that mihrab dome is pretty fancy. It's made with squinches, but like we saw with the tiles, they've taken this concept of the octagon that you need to have for squinches to work on a square shape to make your dome. And they've created intersecting arches to make basically little barrel vaults all intersecting in towards the center of the dome. This is nothing that the Romans and the Byzantines wouldn't come up with. This is unique and a new kind of innovation of these kind of barrel vaults that are getting narrower and narrower as they go to the center of the dome. We call this, in art history, a cantaloupe dome, because back in the day, cantaloupes used to be more ribbed than they are now. Now we just kind of see green stripes on them. And so that was considered like a melon shape. And so you'd be looking at the inset of a melon with all of its seeds. And notice the elaborate decoration all over this dome and the multiplication of it. All right, so now we're moving to a new city. We're going to Granada, Spain. And we're looking at what's called the Muqarnas Dome, Muqarnas. And this is from the Hall of the Two Sisters, and it's in the Palace of the Lions. And it's where we have, again, this kind of elaborate tile work that's being done on the interior. It's really sophisticated. It's more subtle than some of the other ones that we looked at. But now let's look at the dome. This is also a squinched dome, but it's very hard to see because it's hidden in the arms of the stars, or the star itself. We look up above, and just like we saw at Hagia Sophia, we basically have a clear story up there, letting in light. I'm going to turn the light down so you can actually see this thing. All right. Now, you can see it a little bit more clearly here and here. There are these elaborate decorations protruding down from the ceilings, and these are three-dimensional tiles that are like quarters of a dome, and they would mortar them together to make a more dome-like shape, and so that these reach down on the sides and go, so they create their own little dome of domes under each of these corners, and then up here as well. And so it's that property of multiplication of divinity and creativity. And it was an amazing amount of work to be done to create this. So it is also, of course, these buildings are built, they're for political and religious reasons. They're led by religious and political leaders who are using them in part as propaganda to say, look at how good things are, how positive things are. Aren't you happy? Isn't this amazing? And for visitors to come and say, wow, this is amazing. You're amazing that you can do this. All right, so now we're moving out of Spain, and we're going to Iran, and we are looking at another innovation in architecture, and that's going to be the development of the E1 architecture. So here we can see, we've got some fundamental qualities of Muhammad's house. We've got the courtyard, we've got the gateways, we've got gates on 3 sides, and over here is the great hypostyle hall where the prayers are taking place and where offices are. I want you to notice that the roof is now covered with domes, and basically in between each dome is basically a set of columns making a grid. So now domes are in all the rooms, not just a few spots within the rooms of the mosque. It's basically every space of the mosque is going to have the dome over it. But what I really want you to pay attention to are these arches and how they're flat. Now the arch itself is flat right here, but this is turning into a half dome back here. Now we've seen half domes, we saw them in Hagia Sophia, but the difference here is we have pointed arches. And half domes, it wasn't really that interesting in the Byzantine or the Roman Empire to put a flat facade on here. But we've got a flat surface, but then the surface is elaborated with decorative tile work. So it makes the front of it very, very active, even though it's flat. And it creates those nice shaded areas, but look at this kind of cavernous space it creates there. It's almost an embrace, like a hug. You're brought into the sacred space of the mosque. Now, pointed arches are kind of interesting. I've done lots of drawing on the board, so I'm going to try using my hands. When we have a round-headed arch like the Romans invented, I've already talked to you guys about the architectural benefits of those arches. They're pushing against each other in an arcade, and they're holding each other up. But in an arch, there's a tremendous amount of force being pushed down on by gravity, push the sides of the arch away. And it's the fact that you can put arch after arch next to each other that they reinforce each other. So what's happened with Muslim architects is that they've decided that if they go with a pointed arch, it's going to have 2 benefits. And these benefits are pretty impressive. By having the pointed arch, you're going to have less pressure on all the curved zone than you would have had before. And it's going to be higher than a curved arch, so it's going to let in a little bit more light. It's therefore going to be more stable, and you can go ahead and have a really giant one without so much concern over it bursting apart and falling down. Now what's interesting is we've already seen how Byzantine architecture has been reused and kind of expressed, transformed in Islamic architecture, but we're going to see these in a little while in this class make their way back to Europe and become a key part of Christian architecture. So we've got this kind of constant exchange of ideas and techniques and understanding happening in the world. And as we get later and later into history, we can track that more clearly. All right, so we are now in Iraq at the Great Mosque of Samarra. So this is a representation of what the Great Mosque would have looked like. It has been destroyed. This is basically the floor plan. You can see it's a hypostyle hall, and you can see that we have a courtyard in it. This would have been the kind of cool shaded areas around the courtyard. This would be the prayer hall right here. And then right here, this really big building at the front of the mosque, that is this. this giant Malwiya minaret. It's 171 feet tall, so it's really incredibly tall. And it's for supposedly calling people to prayer, although I'm sure you can imagine that whichever person has to climb up there is getting a great workout in order to get to the top of that. It is in a design we had never seen before for a minaret. It's this ramp that spirals up and up and up and around the building, so it makes the climb up slower and easier. And it is unique. It's often called a snail shell minaret. At the time, it would have towered over the landscape, and it would have symbolized kind of an expansion of authority into this area in Iraq. And it gets destroyed like 2 separate times, and finally is not rebuilt. Okay, so here we're looking more at calligraphy, and so we've got the blue Quran here, and I want you to notice that the words are written in gold on this beautiful kind of indigo. This is coming from North Africa. Indigo plants and indigo dyeing are coming out of Africa. And so the parchment, which is a kind of highly processed thin leather that they're writing on, has been dyed this beautiful indigo color, and then gold leaf has been applied to it in order to make it really pop above the blue. All right, so what I want us to do now is I'm gonna have you guys work in groups to answer the questions on the Islamic art study sheet.